It's the distant year of 2015. Man, it's really been 7 years already. Mokey reviews keeping up with the trends as usual. Anyways, 2015. In just the first half of the decade, we received Steins Gate, Angel Beats, and Little Busters. So what? Well, Charlotte, like these two, was written by Jun Maeda, whom you may also know from the visual novel or anime Clannad, and similarly to Steins, delivers a dark storyline with a charming cast of characters. And time travel. Alright, let me make a quick summary for you. The protagonist is a young man, a high school student to be precise, who after certain circumstances gets sent to a special school for people with superpowers. Here he meets his new best friend, a love interest, yada yada. That's like the most basic summary you can make of the plot of Charlotte without spoiling anything major, which is one of the reasons why you may look away when it's mentioned, like I did a few years ago. It wasn't until I familiarized myself with other Jun Maeda works, namely Little Busters and Angel Beats, that I gave it another chance. And although I enjoy it, at least the first time that I watched the show, some flaws that are present in other Studio Key products can be seen more than a few times. But before diving into the show itself, let's deviate a bit to talk about Studio Key and the man, the myth, the legend, Jun Maeda.
While Charlotte isn't a key product per se, it shares a lot of similarities with their works, mainly because Jun Maeda is one of the writers of Studio Key and Charlotte, and because he was pretty much told, hey, remember Angel Beats? Do that again. So for the sake of this discussion, we will consider Charlotte as a key product, and we will compare it with some of the other products of the company in which Maeda was involved. To keep it brief, Key is a Japanese studio formed in
1998. I'll never forget it.
And it's mostly known for important visual novels such as Clannad, Little Busters, among other tear-inducing products. Later, they made anime adaptations of these visual novels and released a few anime original stories, such as this little anime called Angel Beats. As you can infer from the aforementioned products, key releases tend to be emotionally charged, usually ending with the spectator crying for hours due to the stories being shocking, sentimental, or beautiful. This is all fine. After all, Key has its reputation and a loyal fanbase, and there's certainly a lot of thought and passion in these stories. At least, most of them that is. I myself consume lots of Key products, Little Busters being my favorite visual novel, period. And I also quite enjoyed Angel Beats during my teenage years. While I can be a bit biased towards the studio, I understand how these stories work and the risk of being written the way they are. We consider that Key's writing approach can be questionable for some viewers, usually forsaking logic in favor of strong emotions and heartwarming stories. While this is a respectable approach when it comes to writing, it is a double-edged sword, meaning that legitimate emotional moments and lovable characters are a must to connect to the viewer, so the suspension of disbelief can do its job, alas, making you ignore some of the flaws in world building or fails in logic that might be present in the writing.
After all, creating an engrossing world with lots of lore isn't the goal of these stories for the most part. Without going into further spoilers into other Key products, let's just take Little Busters as an example. While the world building is a bit weird, and there's a lot of stuff happening, to the point that your suspension of disbelief must be working to 110% for the climax and ending to work, the goal of the writers was to convey the message of hope and friendship. This means that, if you have a strong attachment to the characters, you will certainly enjoy the story to its fullest, and the plot points that might be a bit convoluted or controversial can be simply overlooked. However, this also means that if you fail to connect with the cast, well,
I have some bad news and a snack for you.
While Key products tend to have very positive reception, its detractors certainly have good points against this type of storytelling, and I don't blame them, really. Other stories, such as Steins Gate, manage to combine the best of both worlds, with memorable characters and unforgettable moments, while keeping a strong narrative with solid world building. One of the key writers of Key is Jun Maeda, who's well known in the Nakige genre of visual novels, doing major work in Air, Clannad, and Little Busters, just to name a few. He develops melancholic narratives that put a bigger focus on the characters and their relationships with family and friends, which end up being real tearjerkers, especially when paired with his musical composition. You can say that his narrative leans to a more emotional approach. That said, he tends to lack a little in the world building department, making the stories risky, as previously mentioned, since the rules of the world don't always hold up to scrutiny.
While these problems are easy to ignore in his visual novels, due to these being longer experiences where we can spend more time expanding the cast of characters, the flaws become more apparent in his animated works. In my opinion, this is the real problem in Maeda's writing in his anime originals. The fact that he's writing a visual novel scenario that has to be condensed in 12 to 13 episodes. This ends with certain moments lacking in emotional build-up, or plot points getting resolved too easily or in an unsatisfactory manner. With that said, we don't believe such faults deserve the extreme backlash that has been building up lately. For those out of the loop, Maeda's writing has been getting less than favorable reviews in recent times, leading to him stating that he'll stop writing stories altogether due to harassment and even death threats. There has been a decline in Jun Maeda's writing for anime series, as we'll express during this video. Does it warrant the extreme reaction from social media? Fuck no, why are you even asking this question? What the fuck is wrong with you?
Our first impressions were different with this anime. Personally, I watched the show during its airing period, and my first impression was mostly positive. I like the show, but my opinion doesn't count. After all, I like High School of the Dead and High School DxD. Later down the line, I rewatched the show, and my perspective was more critical this time. There were several aspects that were not of my liking, such as the pacing and some of the characters. Finally, when I'm watching the show for this review, with a broader perspective and more context regarding its inception, a lot of things began to make sense, like we are solving some sort of puzzle. But don't worry, we will explore them further as the review progresses. Overall, I can say that I enjoyed the show. It wasn't bad, but it could have been better. A lot better.
Now, I have to admit that my first impressions of the series weren't the greatest, considering that I dropped it by episode 4 a few years ago. Although I didn't hate the show, it didn't manage to capture my attention for very long, as the beginning of the series doesn't present a plot that's too different from the wide array of school for kids with superpowers genre. The plot does deviate greatly from this base premise, as I found out on my second watch, and while it does make the story more interesting, this brings its own set of issues as we'll be discussing later.
EA works. They make beautiful animation but fall short in storytelling. Sometimes I wonder whether the studio is cursed or something. We've already covered a PA Works work, that being another, a review that you should watch, but regardless, doing a small cross-reference to Mokey
Flashback.
Only to give credit to PA Works, a studio that always delivers on this front. There's proper use of lights and shadows, alongside a nice variety of moving shots and CG that, while simple, looks really good for its time. When it comes to Charlotte specifically, the anime is bright and colorful for the most part, making it quite pleasing to the eye, with the animation being fluid and nicely done. This brighter color palette can be used to generate a strong contrast when the story features darker moments. This is hard to pull off, as it sometimes can seem like a crutch, making all our cute characters suffer through dark times just cuz. Fortunately, Charlotte is able to strike this balance, at least in the visual department. Character design falls a bit flat, especially within the first arc, as the school setting means the visuals of the cast are limited by the uniforms they are using. Aside from that, some characters do have recognizable silhouettes, and are remembered by a fraction of the anime community. Probably the most recognizable character of the entire series is Tomori Nao, the female lead of the show, whom you may recognize from this meme. She has one of the most out there design of the series, by Charlotte standards, what with her having white hair and bright blue eyes. Jun Maada's works heavily rely on its characters and whether they connect with the viewer, like we said at the beginning. If this condition isn't met, everything starts going downhill. Remember, we're talking about Jun Maada's work, one of the bigger names in the Nakige genre. Thus, you might like the story not by the merits of its world building, which tends to be less than stellar, but rather by the virtue of its characters and emotions. Regardless, let's explore Charlotte's lore and characters. You know the drill, spoiler ahead, skip here, let's go.
Do this, Leroy!
Well, the anime follows Otosaka Yu, a high school student who has the power of possessing people for a few seconds while losing control of his own body in the process. During the first minutes of the show, we get to know more about him, showing that he will take advantage of his powers for his own benefit. Unfortunately, he was being followed, or stalked really, by Tomori Nao, the president of Hoshinomiya Academy's student council. After a failed escape attempt, Yu joins the new academy for kids with superpowers, alongside his sister Ayumi, and the story moves from that point onward. Now, we can divide the anime into 3 main arcs, which vary in terms of scope and quality. This is fine.
The first arc serves mostly as an introduction. Here we get to know the main members of the cast while seeking other students with superpowers to help them. While there are some emotional and shocking scenes, this arc is mostly the slice of life part of the show. Characters goofing around, bonding with each other, usual high school shenanigans, and it serves its purpose.
The second arc is when shit hits the fan. The story gets more emotional and serious. Due to certain circumstances, Yu fails to save his sister, dying after she collapses an entire school. After losing the only family that he had, Yu falls into depression and darkness. Here we can see him sinking into the abyss, getting into fights, being overly violent, and just one step close to becoming a drug addict. However, Nao saves him from his dark abyss, going back into the council to continue moving forward. While this arc used the cheap trick of bridging the cute sister, which I'm not a big fan of, Yu's arc in this part is actually well done. It's interesting to see, understandable from his standpoint, and it feels real. That episode is probably one of the highlights of the series. Emphasis on episode, mainly considered in a vacuum. This is foreshadowing for what's to come.
The third and final arc focuses on a concept presented throughout the show, with Otosaka's missing brother being real. Here we got more information regarding the enemy's universe and backstory, and it is presented to us that his brother could time travel, and he pulled an entire operation to save kids with superpowers. They used to be trapped in the laboratory, but after time traveling shenanigans, they were saved, so no character had to be trapped or captured during the current timeline. However, somehow Yu has memories from different timelines, which doesn't really make sense outside of showing backstory to the viewer. Regardless, and to keep it short, it is presented that Yu could actually save his sister. By stealing his brother's time-traveling powers, he can go back in time and save her. He does this, but after certain incidents, Nao gets kidnapped, Kumagami dies, and Yu loses one eye, rendering his time-traveling powers useless due to needing both functional eyes to work.
In the end, and to solve all issues, Nao and Yu talk about a possible solution to the problem, and they come with the following. Stealing everyone's powers, and I mean literally everyone in the entire fucking planet, so no one can have powers anymore. After all, these powers or whatever are some sort of disease generated by a comet cleverly named Charlotte. Take it like Jun Maeda's take on Stancy. Is this a motherfucking JoJo reference? Well, after some romance, all of a sudden, well really it's an alien interaction, Yu travels around the world, stealing powers in all countries in a very well done sequence. We can see how the whole endeavor affected his brain and sanity. Near the end of his crusade, he's barely alive, but he's saved by a girl, the last person on the entire planet with a superpower. In this case, courage. I know it's mostly symbolic, but it serves its purpose to give the protagonist that final push. It works. So then, he steals that power, which means that he finally accomplished his goal and removed all superpowers from the planet. But then, out of nowhere really, he's rescued somehow by his friends. How they managed to locate him now, and just now.
Unfortunately, all this endeavor had a heavy toll on him, losing all his memories in the process. However, he decides to move on with the help of his friends and family, in a happy yet bittersweet ending. It's certainly a good finale, being the last episode, very interesting and striking. Issues: everything before the finale episode. This one works again better in a vacuum. It's a good closure to such a lousy and cheap previous sequence of events. Story gets overly convoluted with time traveling, secret societies, terrorism, and lots of information dumps. Sadly, the other three members of the main cast, Takayo and the Kurobane siblings, while having a beautiful close to their arcs, are not even related to the main narrative again, working better on their own. It's a shame really, more when these characters are barely relevant during the final stages of the anime.
To keep it brief, it says a lot about the rhythm and tone of the story when you can make 3 different shows just with the arcs alone. The anime lacks focus, and while variety is good when handled properly, Charlotte tried to do way too much with so little. In comparison, Steins Gate has a similar structure in terms of story arcs, mind you in 24 episodes and with a clear source material to follow. Charlotte, on the other hand, being an anime original production, can't use the excuse of bad adaptation or bad source material. Its flaws come from its own inception, that being Angel Beats gone wrong, gone sexual what?
No doubt, one of the highlights of the series is its final episode, where we see Yu travel all around the world stealing the powers from every single person on the planet. After every step of his journey, the toll it takes on him is very noticeable, calling back to the psychotic side of him we saw earlier in the series. The sequence is quite well crafted and high paced considering that we're cramming a world-spanning adventure in roughly 22 minutes. After watching him lose his fucking mind, we get a very cute and hopeful scene with the last person with superpowers, a little girl with the power of courage. A little on the nose, but what can you do? After he's rescued by his friends, we discover that he's lost his memories. But having completed his mission, he's free to live a normal life with his friends and family. It's overall a very good product. In a vacuum. So much that we believe it could easily have been stretched a bit and it could make for a pretty decent standalone OVA. This also makes it feel a bit rushed, as if the plot for half a season got condensed into a single episode. While the downfall of the protagonist is reasonable, it could have used a little more development.
Being familiar with Jun Maeda's works makes it impossible to watch Charlotte without making comparisons between them. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So for this section we're going to focus on Little Busters and Angel Beats, as those are the ones we are more familiar with. After experiencing 3 of Maeda's works, we think it's fair to say that he's got a style pinned down, and that his stories tend to follow the same rhythm, in what we're going to call the Maeda method. The Maeda method has 3 steps. Number 1 is what we call the New World stage. Here we are introduced to the characters and the setting, a world that is similar to ours, but with noticeable differences. It is through those differences that we get to see our characters getting a mix of comedic and emotional moments, while staying mostly lighthearted, although some specks of darkness can be seen. Step 2 is our breaking point, the moment where shit hits the fan. It's emotional, it's depressing, and it changes both the main character and the overall tone of the story. This is also where we confront the dark reality of the world setting, an aspect hidden by the silliness of the first arc. In the case of Little Busters, this happens in the True Ring route, where the missions given by the cat start to feel a bit off. In Angel Beats, it's when Otonashi remembers his cause of death and his goal changes. In the case of Charlotte, it's the death of Ayumi that triggers the shift in narrative. These moments set in motion the last part of this Jun Maeda-shaped puzzle. Step 3. The Truth of the World. This arc is dedicated to explore protagonists and the change in their outlooks, as well as the darker truths of the world they live in. This is the refrain wrote of Little Busters and the last arcs of Angel Beats and Charlotte.
These are the ingredients needed for the perfect Nakige-esque story. In theory at least. The truth is, it doesn't work all that well in Charlotte. Although some of the emotional moments are well executed, especially the darker ones like Ayumi's death and Yu's subsequent breakdown, other plot points are noticeably weaker, such as, well, saving Ayumi through time travel. While the death served to give a more serious tone to the narrative and introduce a new motivation for our protagonist, the time travel effectively bringing her back to life only served to cheapen the emotional blow the audience received. Along with undermining the character development you had because of it, he just gets to have his cake and eat it too. My other gripe with the time travel aspect of the series is that the consequences of undoing certain events are never explored. The most exasperating for me is the fact that the events from episode 8 never happened. Yu never met Jian's vocalist, and thus she never went to see Neo's brother in the hospital to help his recovery. How any writer, editor, storyboarder, intern didn't notice this is beyond me. All of this makes the closing of the story feel quite empty for me. Everybody was happy and well by the end, sure, but it just didn't feel as earned. The price paid for this happiness was Yu's memories, which, of course, it's sad, but they're gonna make new memories, so it's all good in the end. The most I can say is that the symbolism behind Shunsuke losing his eyesight is neat, as he slowly became unable to see the future he was fighting so hard to build. But it has been done better in other series, namely Fullmetal Alchemist. A better bittersweet ending is that of JoJo's Part 3 for me, but that's just me showing JoJo's wherever I can. Charlotte is weird. The best sentence to describe the show is, it's one of the animes of all time. It's a story with high highs and low lows, with a clear identity crisis. Charlotte doesn't really know what it wants to be, and it ends up being more inconsistent than our upload schedule. If you like Little Busters like a lot, then you already watched Charlotte by this point. There are some powerful scenes, but those don't make up for the other set of issues in the production. We can't recommend the show, to be honest, unless you're a fan of the Nakige genre, in which case it's worth giving it a shot. The anime, while it had potential, shows a clear lack of passion and burnout from its main author, Jun Maeda. Things got worse for the man during the past few years. And while the decline in his writing is crystal clear, he doesn't deserve the hate and harassment he has received. If you want to criticize his works, be my guest, but don't attack the man himself. Right now, he's giving a final shot as the writer of this gacha game, so let's see if this is a return to form or the swan song of the man who gave us Kiniko Revolution.
Ah! Schnipp, schnapp! Ah! Ah! Da! Ja! Ich bin Schnappi, das Krokodil! Ah!